there are a lot of ways that we can grow that at the same time we don't really look, it doesn't look good. And Abraham was actually a man who gives us examples of that. We saw that last week when we looked at when Abram went into Egypt with his wife and lied about who his wife was. And the reason for that was because of the reasoning process that he used. It was a worldly reasoning process, and it actually kind of, in a worldly sense, kind of made sense because he was trying to protect himself. But from a spiritual perspective, it wasn't right at all. After coming out of that, he was extremely blessed, again, even though he had done something wrong. And God had blessed him by the hand of Pharaoh. And so when he came out of Egypt going north, it says that he had a multitude of, he was rich in gold, silver, and even in cattle because he'd been given so many things. God continues to bless him even though he hasn't done everything right. And that's an encouraging thing to me, but it's also interesting when we look at this. This is going to be in Genesis chapter 13. When he comes out of Egypt, he had a lot of possessions, a lot more than when he went into Egypt. And this was also during famine. Remember, that's the reason he went into Egypt to begin with, because of famine. I don't know if the famine has led up, that's why he's able to go back, or if he's just decided to leave because he had gotten himself into some trouble there. But whatever the reason, he's leaving, and he's going north into the area of what we know as the Canaan land. It says, Abraham went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him to the south. Now, your translation may say the Negev. That is literally the Negev. My translation kind of interpreted that to be the south. It doesn't mean south, it means deserted place. So he went up, and it's actually, it would be south of Jerusalem. And it's about halfway in between Jerusalem and the border of Egypt. Somewhere in that area is called the Negev. It's a region. And it was the desolate place. It was dry there. And so there wasn't a lot there for the crops, for the animals, which was an important part of this next discussion. And here he is. He's there. He comes out and it says, Abraham was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. So this is because of the blessings that God continues to give him. And it's almost like, it seems like with David, when in his younger years, everything he touched seemed to turn to gold. Not literally, but everything seemed to work out for him. And the same thing with Abram. It didn't matter what happened, things were working out for him in his favor because God was with him and had made these promises to him and to his children. And he was going to see it through because of his faithfulness. And so he says that, it says in verse 3, he went on his journey from the south as far as Bethel to the place his tent had been at the beginning between Bethel and Ai. So he got into the Negev and realized he didn't have enough land. He didn't have enough ability to feed his flocks. And so he went north to between Bethel and Ai, which he had been before, and this is where he had built an altar. And it says, to the place of the altar which he had made there at first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. So here he is again, coming to worship. This is a place he had built up before, so that he could come back to this. It's kind of a bookmark, as so to speak. This is a place in his life that he can keep coming back to, and it's a place that was familiar to him. And he had built this altar there in order to offer sacrifices. It says that Lot also, who went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. This is actually the first time we learned that Lot was with him when they went into Egypt, but he came out of Egypt with him. And it says that the land in verse 6 was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. So here we have a problem that comes up. And even though they got out of the Negev and they went up north a little bit toward Jerusalem, it's between Bethel and Ai. There should have been plenty of room for them to spread out, but they were having problems because Abram was so rich, and evidently Lot had gained some too. And as a result, they're having problems and difficulties that came because their shepherds were starting to fight each other. And there's problems because they didn't have the room that they needed to have. And they didn't have the necessary, I would imagine the wells would be a problem. I would imagine also just places for them to graze. It's very different than what we think of today. I mean, you can't go very far before you're on someone else's land, right? But that's not the way it was there. The cities were owned by the city kings, but then outside you may have some houses in different places, and they may go ahead and till the land and work the land. It was kind of an open community, evidently. And especially where the flocks went, they would just kind of wander from place to place, and the feeding their sheep and whatever else that they had. And in doing that, of course, they had to kind of respect the other people that were around doing the same things. Well, you kind of you would have a tendency to find the places that are most suitable and that you can function in the best way, and there's not a whole lot of other people doing the same thing around. You're going to try to find your spot. And this evidently between Bethel and Ai, where he built this altar, was just such a place. But now, since he had come out of Egypt, things had changed a little bit because he had received even more, and now he's feeling the growth pains. But it's wonderful to see this problem because it shows us that Abram also understood how to reason correctly, how to reason according to spiritual matters. And even though he made mistakes in the past from fear, this is a situation where he can actually show us some good example of what it means to have, I call it faith reasoning. Faith reasoning and worldly reasoning they're not mutually exclusive, but they're not a different kind of reasoning. It's not that we have a different logic system than the world. It's just that the information that we put into that logical reasoning is different from what the world has to put into that logical reasoning. It's like a computer system. Whatever you put in is what you're going to get out. And if you are putting in worldly reasoning and worldly ideas and worldly philosophies into that computer system, you're going to get worldly answers that come out. But if you put spiritual ideas in there and spiritual principles, and you put it in there and you calculate in that sense, you're going to get spiritual answers to come out. So whatever we put in is what is going to be a result of that. That means our thinking process needs to be in the right place. And so we can look at this and we can think, Romans chapter 10 and verse 17 says, faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. Faith reasoning means that we're looking at the evidence that we're using, the information that we're using to make decisions is all about what God says and not about what we think we can look around and find for ourselves. So that's the kind of reasoning we have to deal with, especially when we're making difficult decisions and we're facing problems and challenges with life. But it's so easy for us when we face a problem to use the wrong kind of calculations, and we go to the worldly ideas. The world says that I should do this, or it makes sense for us to say I should do this. Common sense can even be a part of that. And we throw all the common sense and the ideas in together, and we make a decision based on that. But sometimes we forget to include what God says. So we need to make sure that we're reasoning according to faith. And this is an example of that. And it's interesting here because if you go through this situation, we have the conflict that's building. Instead of ignoring it, I'm assuming he ignored it for a little bit. That's what we all tend to do. But at least at one point, he decided to address it. Because it says in verse 6, the land was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. The Canaanites and the Perizzites then dwelt in the land. So Abram said to Lot, please let there be no strife between you and me, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. So the first lesson we see here is that he addressed the problem that was presenting itself. And you might say, well, that just makes perfect sense. And it does make perfect sense. But a lot of times we don't address the problem when we see it. We simply let it continue to fester. And it's almost like we throw up our hands and say, well, let's just see what happens with this. It's not always the wrong thing to do, but it sometimes is the wrong thing to do. And this kind of situation, you have to kind of reason, think about this. What is the end result going to be? Is it going to get any better on its own? The only possible way that this could actually get better is if they find more room. And so this is what Abram decides he has to talk to him about. He says, we're brethren. Let's not let this be an issue. Let's not let this be a problem. Let there be no strife between us because we're family, right? That's the idea. Now, if we're going to make some application for us, this is a pretty easy one for us. We need to have the same kind of attitude. We need to make sure that we are looking to other people. Let's not fight with one another, right? Now, thankfully, we have peace here, and I'm glad for that. But there are always going to be times when we have to be aware that there could be situations that brew, and we don't know when or how that's going to happen. But we need to be ready for them and learn how to address them from what I call spiritual or faith reasoning, so that we can make sure we do the right thing if things come up, or maybe I should say when. And the only reason I say when is because we're human beings, right? We all are facing these things, all of us at some point in our lives, we can look around and probably find some places in our life where we're having conflict right now. Sometimes it's better to just let things lie. Sometimes it's better to not address it immediately, but just see how things work out, because sometimes things do tend to work out. But at other times, we need to be wise enough to see that this thing is not going to work out unless we do something about it. And those are the times we need to make sure we step in. And so anyway, he goes into this and he says, we're having strife. We need to stop this. We don't want to have any strife. We're brethren. And he says in verse 9, is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take the left, then I will go to the right. Or if you go to the right, then I will go to the left. So here is a solution that he provides to Lot. And this was something I'm sure he thought of in advance. But can you imagine saying this? It seems from the text that it's very likely that Abram had a lot more flock or sheep and things like that than Lot did. It doesn't say, but it's very likely because of all the blessings that he has. But at the same time, he is the one that says, okay, you choose. Now, that's a pretty bold statement. Now, when our kids were growing up, if they had a piece of candy or something they had to split, we would tell one to split it and the other got to choose which one they wanted. That made them fair. They would get rulers out. I mean, they would if it was like candy. Sometimes they would weigh it to make sure they were both perfect. Right? Whoever was splitting it, they made sure it was fair. You would think that would be what he did, but he didn't actually even say that. He said, "Hey, why don't you just pick which way you want to go, left hand or right hand?" And I wondered, reading that, why in the world would someone with such wealth give up such, or have the potential of giving up so much? And it turns out that he did give up quite a bit, because if you read what happened it says in verse 10, Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you go towards Zoar. So now Lot looks up and he recognizes, he sees the area, he's trying to decide where you want to go. Now, if you were in Lot's shoes and you're looking around and you can have your pick of which way to go, don't you think you would pick the one that was the best for you? That's what we all would do. And this is what Lot did. I can't fault Lot for doing that. Abram told him to pick a side, and he decided to go. Now, one of the problems with that is that there was Sodom that was there. And in fact, it said that in verse 12, Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. And what that means is he was camping out in the places. He was living in tents like he had been doing, but he went almost into Sodom. He was as far as Sodom with this. But this was lush land. This was land that it's not like that today. But he chose that, and as a result, it could be that he chose foolishly, or maybe he just decided to get too close to Sodom, but he was certainly influenced to some degree, or at least it troubled him, according to Peter, that he lived it troubled him on a daily basis. But when we see him next, after this is all over, the next time we see him, he's actually living inside Sodom. And So that could have been because it was just easier. I don't know. We'll get into that, I guess, when we get to it. But at this time, this is lush land, and it looks like something he would do. And Abram had to know that Lot was going to choose which way he was going to choose. And even though Abram still had room where he was, he probably would have been better off if he had gone toward Sodom like Lot had. But he gave that up. So you have to ask why. Why would he do that? And it's obvious. There are a lot of things you could think of to explain that, and we all can understand that. First of all, Abram understood that all that land was his anyway. God had promised it to him already in the past, and it's for his descendants. It didn't really matter what Lot did or didn't do. God was going to give him that land. So he could have been reasoning about that, thinking, well, I'm going to give this up for now, but it doesn't really matter. And we also could think about this in the sense that he was hoping that Lot would maybe split that with him. I don't know, but reasoning had to come in somewhere. And when Lot then chose for himself all the plain of Jordan, he journeyed east and they separated from each other. And now, don't get me wrong, this is not a lesson saying that there's any separation that needs to be done. That was a forced situation because it was an absolute necessity. But the point is that we need to make sure we're trying to find solutions. But if you think about the faith reasoning, I want you to turn into Romans chapter 12. And this is, I understand, very basic things, but it is important for us to get the lesson from this. Romans chapter 12, and this is really the kind of the crux of what the book of Romans is shooting toward. That is, starting in verse 1, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. And then he spends the rest of the chapter talking about how to transform your mind, what that looks like in different areas of life and in different ways and modalities. And so if you look at verse 9, he says, let love be without hypocrisy. Abhor what is evil, cling to what is good. Be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love, in honor giving preference to one another. In honor giving preference to one another. This is what we see back in Genesis chapter 13. He understood that because they were brethren, because they were family, he should give preference to Lot. Now, you might think that Lot had an obligation to give preference back to Abram. I would agree. But Abram is here showing faith reasoning. He understood that the relationship he had with his nephew was more important than the land that was up for grabs. And that's very difficult for us to understand sometimes. We get caught up in the things. Now, this land was not was not something that was just a frivolous thing. This wasn't just for him to have vacation spots. This was his livelihood that we're talking about. And the things the decisions that he made affected not just him, but evidently lots and lots of servants that also he was responsible for taking care of, and whether they were hired out or taken, I don't know. But he was responsible for caring for them. They were responsible for caring for the flocks. And so he had a lot of people in his family and in his circle that he was responsible for. So every decision that he made affected them as well. And whenever he decided things need to change, he didn't consider the needs of his flock as much as he considered the relationship that he had between Lot and himself. And I'm not suggesting that he didn't care about the people that he was responsible for, but it made it a lot more of a burden on him after he offered this to Lot, and Lot went his way. It would have been easier if he would have said to Lot, hey, we're obviously having problems. My flock's bigger than yours. I'm just going to go this way towards Sodom, and I'm going to take this, and you just stay here and do what you want. He could have easily said that, but he didn't. He gave preference. That's a difficult lesson for us because we want to hold on to ours. This is mine. I want to hang on to it. And this is what Romans chapter 12 really is talking about, that we be not conformed to this world, but be transformed, Romans chapter 12 and verse 2, by the renewing of your mind, that you prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. So we are kindly affectionate to one another, in honor giving preference to one another. And this is something that we as Christians do. We look around each other, and if we're having difficulties, and really even if we're not having difficulties, we see each other in a better light than we even look at ourselves. We're trying to elevate the people who are around us. In our team discussion we had the other night, we threw yarn around the room. It was kind of weird, but we would throw yarn to someone and tell them one thing that we thought that they could do in the church that we'd never seen them do, as an encouragement. Hey, I think you're good at I think you would be good at this. And we did that, and it was a challenge to come up with some, especially with some of them. And no one ever came up with anything for me, but I just got to let them off the hook and said, you don't have to worry about it. But the point was that they were encouraged, and the exercise really is a good way to not only encourage people, but also for you to start thinking of someone else and to help elevate other people. See, this is what really the root of encouragement is about. It's thinking of someone else and helping them to see themselves in a way they may not see themselves yet, but the way that God can see them, or maybe see them in a best light that's possible. That's really at the heart of what kindness is. We see other people in the light of how they are with God and how their life is, and how we can help them perhaps be better, to elevate them. And this is where a lot of Christian work needs to be done on ourselves. This is a difficult one for me. And I look around and I see people, and my brain automatically starts thinking, okay, I've got projects I need to get done. I need to ask some people to help me to do some things. Or I see people as what's the word? Assets. Not to that extreme, but I have a tendency to look at people and I think of myself when I see other people. And that certainly is not the way we should be. We look around at other people, we see their lives, and we ask the question, how is it that I can help them in their life? That's what being a Christian is about. And so we are transforming our minds. And that process of the fruit of the Spirit really ultimately becomes a point of love. If we actually love other people, we don't just treat them well, we help them become better of who they are. And we try to find ways to do that. Then Philippians Chapter 2 is another passage that relates to this. And of course, we know that this is usually, we come to verse 5 because he says, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being the form of God did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant and coming in the likeness of men. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. Therefore, God also has highly exalted him and given him the name which is above every name. So this is the lifestyle that Jesus chose, and it's an example for us of what it means to empty ourselves, to humble ourselves, and to live and act for the betterment of others. It's not for the betterment of me, it's for the betterment of others. And that the worldly thinking, the worldly reasoning is, I need to make sure I have my own. I need to make sure I take care of me. And we should take care of ourselves. But spiritual reasoning says, what can I do if I've got my bases covered now? What do I do for that other person to actually help them improve in their lives? And not being a busybody, that doesn't mean that I need to go into your life and start giving you a list of things that you need to do to improve. That's not the point at all. In fact, if I love you, I'm going to find out what you're trying to attempt and what is important to you and help you do that. Because it's not up to me what you do, it's up to you, right? And we all have that same kind of personal growth and development. But I want you to look at what he says in, let's read the first four verses here. He said in chapter 2, therefore, if there is any consolation in Christ, if any comfort of love, if any fellowship of the Spirit, if any affection and mercy, fulfill my joy by being like-minded. If there is any consolation in Christ, or comfort in love, if there is any affection and mercy, it should be distributed toward other people. fulfill my joy by being like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind. And this mind is certainly what we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 10. It says that we should all have the same mind, that we think the same way about things. Yes, doctrinally speaking, we should all agree, but this is really beyond simple doctrine. This mind that we have should be the same. All of us should have the same mind, and he explains here even further that we have the same love, that we are of one mind. He says, let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. If you're a normal person, you usually will think that you're at least equal, if not better, than the people who are around you. That's human nature. Some people have a difficult time with it, and so they think everyone's better than them at everything. That's not really what he's talking about here. He's not talking about beating yourself down. It is a mindset shift that we look around to other people and we consider them better. We look at them and we say, what can I do to help them? Because let's talk about them and how they're improving their lives. Look at what they're doing in the church. Look at what is going on in their lives, how they're helping things. And we start thinking that way. You know, it's interesting when we start noticing or we start thinking about it, we'll notice when other people do things, and it becomes a little easier for us. One of the most frustrating things in a church, in my opinion, growing up, this is the way it was in different places, was when you have a lot of things you're wanting to do, but you look around and you think nobody's doing anything. I've been in that place before, and I've looked around and said, man, nobody's doing anything. But I didn't notice. I didn't see people sending cards. I didn't see people making phone calls. I didn't see people who were reaching out and trying their best. And this was a long process for me. I remember someone called me up one time, and he was complaining about the congregation he was at. He wasn't a preacher or anything. And he said, the church is just dead. They don't do anything. And my first question was, what are you doing? He didn't like that. But I said, you're the church. If you're not doing anything, maybe that's why you don't notice everyone else doing something. Maybe they are doing things and you don't realize it. It's a good possibility. Our job is not to look around at everybody else and judge whether or not we're doing enough. Our job is to look into people's lives and say, how can I help? What can I do? One of the things, and I'm going to embarrass him for a minute, but one of the things I absolutely adore about Brad is every time I see him, either before or after, or maybe both, when the conversation is beginning or ending, he'll say, what can I do for you? He always does it. And I appreciate it a lot. And it usually puts me on, even though I know it's going to be asked, I'm usually put off guard, and I'm like, I don't know. Because I really don't, because he does so much already. How could I ask him to do even more? But I love that attitude, and he's not the only one that does it, but it's a good example for us. If you've been around him very much, you'll hear the same question. The idea is to look around at other people and say, how can I be of service? And this is exactly the attitude that Abram had with Lot. And it actually helped diffuse this situation that could have been really bad. We could have had civil war at this point. Things were escalating, and they were beginning to fight with one another. And he says, we're brethren. We're a family. We shouldn't be doing it. You pick. He sacrificed himself and said, you make the decision where you want to go. And he gave it all up. He just said, whatever I have is yours. And he allowed him to take it. It doesn't say anything in there that he looked at Lot with disdain after Lot picked the best land. It almost seems like he was happy that things happened, that worked out the way they were, because he was reasoning with faith. And he knew that he was looking for something that was far beyond what he was standing on right there anyway. In the book of Hebrews chapter 11, we read this several times already, but it says in verse 16, it says, now they desire a better, that is a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. In verse 14, it says, for those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. In verse 13, it says, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. So he recognized he's just he didn't actually own any land. At this point, the only land he'll actually own in his entire life, as rich as he was, the only land that we can see that he owned was a burial plot for his wife. But he was waiting for something better. And he knew the promises of God, and he knew that he could trust God. And we should be the same way. It doesn't matter what we give up for the benefit of other people. It doesn't matter if we give up things so that other people can benefit, because this is a spiritual journey that we're on.